Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Location: Atchafalaya National Wildlife Refuge, Louisiana. Date: August 8, 2017. The heat arrived before the sun did, thick and wet, settling over the Atchafalaya Basin like a wool blanket soaked in warm water. Brooke Thibodeau stood on the dock behind the refuge station, watching the mist rise off the black water in slow, curling tendrils that seemed almost deliberate in their movement. The cypress trees emerged from the fog like the bones of drowned giants, their knees jutting up through the surface, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that hung motionless in the still air. No breeze. There was never any breeze in August. Just the heat, and the humidity, and the constant chorus of insects that served as the swamp's heartbeat. She'd been a wildlife biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service for 9 years, the last 4 spent here in the Atchafalaya, studying the American alligator population that called this labyrinth of waterways home. She knew these animals better than she knew most people, knew their hunting patterns, their territorial behaviors, the subtle differences between a warning hiss and a genuine threat display. She'd tagged over 200 individuals, tracked their movements through breeding seasons and droughts, documented their remarkable adaptability in the face of human encroachment. Alligators were her life's work, her passion, her area of expertise, which is why she knew with absolute certainty that an alligator had not killed those men. She finished her coffee, chicory blend, black, the only way to drink it this early, and went back inside to review the case files one more time. 3 victims in 14 days. The first had been a local named Beaumont Arsenault, 57, found wedged in the crook of a bald cypress 30 feet above the waterline. No bite marks, no lacerations, no signs of struggle. Just a dead man in a tree with an expression on his face that the responding deputy had described as like he's seen the devil himself rise up out of the water. The second victim was a tourist from Texas, Gerald Hoffman, 62, discovered in similar circumstances a week later. Different tree, same impossible height, same absence of visible trauma. The medical examiner had listed cause of death as cardiac arrest, likely induced by extreme fear, but couldn't explain how a man with a broken leg and no climbing experience had ended up 40 feet off the ground. And now, there was a third, Garrett Phelps, 34, a fishing guide from Henderson who'd taken a client into the basin 3 days ago and never came back. The client had been found drifting in their John boat near Bayou Sorrel, unharmed but catatonic, unable or unwilling to speak. Garrett's body had been recovered yesterday afternoon, perched in the highest branches of a water oak on the edge of Lake Fosse Point. No injuries, no explanation. Just that same frozen scream on his face, those same wide eyes staring at something that wasn't there anymore. The sheriff's department was calling them alligator attacks. It was easier than admitting they had no idea what was happening in the swamp. Brooke knew better. She just didn't know what to call the alternative. The morning briefing was held in the refuge's main office, a cramped room with a window unit air conditioner that rattled and wheezed, but never quite managed to push the temperature below 80 degrees. Sheriff Roy Benoit was there, along with 2 of his deputies and a representative from Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Brooke sat in the corner, flipping through the photographs she'd already memorized, waiting for someone to say something that made sense. "We're recommending a closure of the Eastern Basin until further notice," Sheriff Benoit said, pointing to a map that was already marked with red X's at each recovery site. "No fishing, no hunting, no recreational access. We've got a nuisance gator team coming in from Baton Rouge tomorrow to survey the area and remove any aggressive animals." "With respect, Sheriff," Brooke said, not looking up from the photographs, "there's no evidence that alligators were involved in any of these deaths." The room went quiet. Deputy Trosclair, a young man with more ambition than experience, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we found the bodies in trees. Gators chase people up trees all the time." "Gators don't chase people up trees, that's a myth," Brooke finally looked up, meeting his eyes. Alligators are ambush predators. They strike from concealment, drag their prey into the water and drown it. They don't pursue, they don't climb, and they certainly don't leave their kills intact and posed like mannequins in a department store window. She held up one of the photographs. Garrett Phelps frozen in that final moment of terror. Look at his hands. No defensive wounds. No bark under his fingernails. He didn't climb that tree. He was placed there. Placed there by what? Sheriff Benoit asked. Brooke didn't have an answer. She'd been asking herself the same question for 2 weeks. She took her boat out alone that afternoon, against the sheriff's recommendation, following the GPS coordinates to the site where Garrett Phelps had been found. The sun was directly overhead by then, and the swamp had taken on that peculiar midday stillness where even the insects seemed to hold their breath. The water was the color of coffee with too much cream, opaque and warm, revealing nothing of what moved beneath its surface. Brooke cut the engine and let the boat drift, studying the tree where they'd found the body. It was a water oak, ancient and massive, its trunk rising straight out of the shallows before exploding into a canopy of branches that blocked out the sky. Spanish moss hung from every limb like funeral shrouds, swaying slightly in a breeze Brooke couldn't feel. The branch where Garrett had been found was at least 50 feet up, a branch that couldn't have supported his weight while he was alive, that should have snapped the moment he tried to climb onto it. But there he'd been, sitting upright, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. She heard it then. A sound that didn't belong in the catalog of swamp noises she'd spent 4 years memorizing. Not a splash, not a bird call, not the grunt of a gator or the splash of a gar. Something else. A low, rhythmic breathing, wet and labored, coming from somewhere in the trees to her left. She turned slowly, her hand moving instinctively toward the holstered pistol on her belt, and scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just moss and shadow and the endless watching silence of the swamp. But the breathing continued, and now she could hear something else beneath it. A sound like claws on bark, like something heavy pulling itself through the branches overhead. She looked up, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, she saw a shape silhouetted against the light filtering through the canopy. Too large to be human, too wrong in its proportions. A head that was almost canine, shoulders too broad, limbs that bent at angles that made her stomach lurch. Then it was gone, and the swamp was silent again, and Brooke was alone on the water with her heart hammering in her chest and the absolute certainty that she was being watched. Garrett Phelps had known these waters his whole life. He'd been born in Henderson, raised on crawfish and catfish and the particular brand of Cajun stubbornness that came from living in a place the rest of the world had forgotten. His grandfather had run a fishing camp on the edge of the basin, and his father after him, and now Garrett carried on the tradition, taking tourists out into the swamp to catch bass and gar and the occasional alligator gar that could grow longer than a man was tall. He knew every channel, every sandbar, every hidden pocket of deep water where the big fish liked to hide. He knew the sounds the swamp made at night, the calls of owls and nightjars and the distant prehistoric bellowing of bull gators during mating season. He did not know the sound he heard on the night of August 5th. It started as a howl, not a wolf's howl, nothing that clean or natural, but something that started low and rose into a pitch that seemed to vibrate in his chest, in his teeth, in the roots of his hair. His client, an accountant from Shreveport named Dale, had gone pale and gripped the sides of the John boat so hard his knuckles turned white. "What the hell was that?" Dale whispered. Garrett didn't answer. He was listening. The howl had faded, but now there was something else. Footsteps, impossibly, walking on water. Not splashing through the shallows, but walking on the surface. Each step producing a soft, wet impact, like a palm slapping against skin. Coming closer. "We need to go," Garrett said, reaching for the outboard motor. "Now." But the motor wouldn't start. He pulled the cord once, twice, 3 times, and each time the engine coughed and died, as if something was choking it from within. The footsteps were closer now, and Garrett could see the water rippling in the darkness, concentric circles spreading out from points of contact that shouldn't have been possible. Something was walking toward them across the surface of the bayou. something that moved with a terrible, patient deliberation. Dale screamed. Garrett looked up. It was standing on the water 10 feet from the boat. Tall, 8 feet, maybe 9, with a body that was almost human but wrapped in something that might have been fur or might have been shadow. Its face was the worst part. A wolf's muzzle, but elongated, distorted, with eyes that glowed a faint, sickly yellow in the darkness. And it was looking at him. Not at Dale. At him. Studying him. Choosing. "Run," Garrett whispered, though he knew there was nowhere to run, nothing but water and darkness and the thing that stood upon the waves. "Dale, run." Dale didn't run. Dale didn't move. Dale just stared, his mouth open, his eyes glazed as the creature took another step toward the boat. And another. And another. Garrett felt something close around his chest. Not hands, not claws, but a pressure. An invisible force that lifted him out of the boat and into the air as if he weighed nothing at all. He couldn't scream. Couldn't breathe. Could only watch as the swamp fell away beneath him, as the creature's yellow eyes stayed fixed on his, as he was carried upward into the branches of the water oak and set gently, almost tenderly, onto a limb that shouldn't have held him. The last thing Garrett Phelps saw was the creature's face, inches from his own, studying him with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been hunger. The last thing he felt was his heart, hammering so hard against his ribs that he was certain it would burst. And the last thing he heard was a voice, not spoken, not exactly, but pressed directly into his mind. A voice that said, in tones of ancient and infinite patience, "Not yet." But soon, then the darkness took him, and Garrett Phelps was gone. Brooke found the nest 3 days later. She'd been following a pattern she'd noticed on the map. The 3 body sites formed a rough triangle around a patch of flooded forest that wasn't supposed to exist. The satellite imagery showed solid land there, a small island of higher ground in the midst of the basin. But when she navigated her boat through the increasingly narrow channels, she found only water and something else. Bones, hundreds of them, scattered across the shallow bottom, visible through the murky water like pale fingers reaching up from the mud. Human bones, animal bones, bones so old they'd begun to calcite, and bones so fresh they still had scraps of tissue clinging to them. They formed a ring around a single cypress tree, the largest Brooke had ever seen, its trunk easily 30 feet in diameter, its roots spreading out across the water like the legs of some enormous spider. The smell hit her next, not decay, something older, mustier, like a wet dog left in a closed room for weeks. It coated the back of her throat, made her eyes water, triggered some primal response in her hindbrain that screamed at her to leave, to run, to get as far from this place as possible. Her radio crackled. "Brooke, this is base, you copy?" She keyed the mic, never taking her eyes off the tree. "I copy. I found something. Sending coordinates now." "Negative on that, Brooke. We've got weather coming in. You need to head back." She looked up. The sky, which had been clear an hour ago, had turned the color of a bruise, purple and black and swollen with rain. The wind had picked up, sending ripples across the water, making the Spanish moss sway like something alive. And in the branches of the great cypress something moved, something that had been watching her the whole time. "Brooke, do you copy? Return to base immediately." She watched it descend, not climbing, flowing, like shadow given weight and form. It moved from branch to branch with a liquid grace that no living thing should possess, and as it came closer, she could see its face clearly for the first time. The muzzle, the eyes, the way its lips pulled back from teeth that were too long, too sharp, too many. The rougarou, the thing her grandmother had warned her about when she was a child, the monster that haunted the swamps and punished the wicked. She'd stopped believing in it when she was 10 years old. She'd been wrong. It stopped on a branch 20 feet above her, crouching, watching, those yellow eyes fixed on hers with an intelligence that was unmistakably, terrifyingly human. "Not you," the voice said in her mind. "Not yet. You still have work to do." And then it was gone, and Brooke was alone in the gathering storm, surrounded by bones, knowing with absolute certainty that she had been judged and, for now, found wanting. The official report listed the 3 deaths as accidental drownings complicated by alligator activity. The bone site was never mentioned. The witness, Dale, the accountant from Shreveport, recovered from his catatonic state after 6 weeks of inpatient psychiatric care and claimed to remember nothing of the night Garrett Phelps died. Brooke never told anyone what she saw. What would she say? That a creature from Cajun folklore had shown her its hunting ground and decided to let her live? That she'd looked into the eyes of something older than the swamp itself and seen a patience that spanned centuries? She still works in the Atchafalaya. Still studies her alligators, still files her reports, still drinks her chicory coffee on the dock each morning while the mist rises off the black water. But she doesn't go into the eastern basin anymore, doesn't go near the Great Cypress or the ring of bones that surrounds it. And some nights when the moon is full and the swamp goes quiet in that particular way, that means something is moving through it, she hears the howling, distant, patient, waiting. The rougarou doesn't kill everyone it catches. Some it releases, some it marks. Brooke touches the scar on her palm, the one she doesn't remember getting, the one that appeared the morning after she visited the nest. It's shaped like a crescent moon, like a bite that never quite broke the skin. She has 93 days left. Then she'll know which kind she is. Location: Olympic National Park, Washington, Hoh Rainforest. Date: November 8, 2017. The Hoh Rainforest existed in a state of permanent twilight. Even at midday, the canopy of Sitka spruce and western hemlock filtered the Washington sky into something gray and diffuse, a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel Marsh had worked Olympic National Park for 11 years, and in that time he had learned to love the particular quality of that light. The way it softened edges, made the ancient trees seem to breathe, turned the hanging curtains of moss into something from a fever dream. The forest was alive in ways that forests shouldn't be. He'd accepted that long ago. This morning the rain fell in a fine mist that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite fog. Something in between that coated everything in a sheen of moisture and muffled all sound to a whisper. Daniel stood on the porch of the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center at 7:15, drinking his second coffee of the day, watching the parking lot slowly fill with the first visitors of the morning. A school bus had arrived 20 minutes earlier, Jefferson Elementary according to the magnetic sign on its side, and he'd watched 2 teachers corral approximately 20 children into something resembling order before leading them toward the Hall of Moss's Trail. Field trips were common this time of year. The rainforest's accessibility made it popular with schools throughout western Washington, and the shorter autumn days meant teachers wanted to get their outdoor education hours in before winter made everything impractical. Daniel had done the ranger talk for school groups perhaps 100 times. The ecosystem, the rainfall, the delicate balance of life and decay that made this place unique. Today, a younger ranger named Kelsey was handling the morning program. Daniel had the afternoon patrol. He finished his coffee and went inside to check the morning reports. Trail conditions were standard for November. Muddy in the lower sections, some standing water on the Spruce Nature Trail, nothing impassable. The weather forecast called for continued rain through the weekend, temperatures hovering around 8 degrees Celsius. Normal. Everything was normal. The radio crackled at 9:47. Dispatch, this is Ranger Kelsey at Hall of Mosses. I have a situation. The voice was controlled, professional, but Daniel had worked with Kelsey long enough to hear the tightness beneath the words. We have missing children. Repeat, missing children. 6 students from the Jefferson Elementary group separated from their class approximately 30 minutes ago, ages 7 to 9. I need all available personnel. Daniel was moving before the transmission ended, grabbing his pack and his radio, his body responding to years of training while his mind raced through possibilities. Children wandered off constantly. It was practically inevitable with school groups, but they rarely stayed lost for long. The Hall of Mosses Trail was a short loop, well marked, bordered by the kind of dense undergrowth that discouraged off-trail exploration. There was nowhere for 6 children to go. except, of course, into the forest itself. And the forest went on forever. He keyed his radio as he jogged toward the trailhead. Dispatch, Ranger Marsh responding. ETA to Hall of Mosses, 4 minutes. Do we have descriptions on the missing children? The response came fragmented, names and ages and clothing colors that blurred together. 6 children, 3 girls, 3 boys. All wearing the bright yellow vests the school had provided for visibility. Yellow should be easy to spot against the endless green and brown of the rainforest. Should be. But as Daniel entered the trail and felt the canopy close above him like a door swinging shut, he found himself thinking about the stories he'd heard over the years. Stories the Kino and Quileute elders sometimes shared late at night when they thought the Park Service people weren't listening. Stories about things that lived in the deep forest, things that called to travelers with whistles and songs, things that took people away and sometimes brought them back changed. The old people called them Tsiatko, stick Indians, shadow people who walked between the massive trunks of the ancient trees, thin as the branches they hid behind, patient as the moss that grew on everything. They taught their children never to whistle in the forest, never to answer if something whistled back. Daniel had always dismissed those stories. He was a scientist by training, a rationalist by temperament. The forest was just a forest, strange and beautiful and indifferent to human concerns, but not malevolent, not aware. But as he pushed deeper into the Hall of Mosses, past the point where the maintained trail gave way to something older and less defined, he noticed the silence. Not the usual quiet of the rainforest, which was full of subtle sounds, dripping water, rustling ferns, the distant calls of varied thrushes. This was different. This was absence, as if someone had pressed mute on the entire world. And somewhere ahead, so faint he might have imagined it, he heard a whistle. Ms. Harper had counted them. She had counted them 3 times before they left the visitor center, counted them again at the trailhead, counted them at every stopping point along the way. 23 students. She'd been teaching 3rd grade for 15 years, and she'd learned that counting was the only thing that kept field trips from becoming disasters. So when she turned around at the viewing platform near the big maple tree and counted only 17, she felt the floor drop out from beneath her reality. Where are the others? Her voice came out sharper than intended. The remaining students stared at her with wide eyes. Kelsey, the young ranger who'd been leading their tour, stopped mid-sentence about the symbiotic relationship between moss and bark. Which others, Ms. Harper? 6 of them. Zoe, Marcus, the Patterson twins, little James Chen, and she couldn't remember the 6th name. Why couldn't she remember? They were right here. They were right here 5 minutes ago. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Had she actually seen them at this platform? She remembered counting at the previous stop, the one by the fallen nurse log. 23. But the image was fuzzy somehow, like a photograph left in the rain. Had she really counted, or had she just assumed? Kelsey was already on her radio, her voice calm but urgent. The other teacher, Mr. Paulson, began gathering the remaining students into a tight group. Ms. Harper stood frozen, trying to reconstruct the last 30 minutes, and found that she couldn't. The timeline had become unreliable, full of gaps and overlaps that didn't make sense. The rain continued to fall, soft and relentless. The moss-covered trees stood silent around them, watching with patience older than memory. And somewhere in the forest, 6 children walked a path that wasn't on any map, following a sound that no adult could hear. Zoe didn't know why she'd left the group. One moment she was standing with the others, listening to the ranger lady talk about how old the trees were, and the next moment she was walking into the green darkness between 2 massive trunks, her feet moving on their own, her mind floating somewhere peaceful and strange. The whistling was beautiful. That was the thing the grown-ups would never understand, how beautiful it was. Not like a person whistling, not like the songs her dad sometimes hummed while making breakfast. This was something else. It was the sound the forest would make if the forest could sing, and it was calling her name. and she had to follow it because following it was the most important thing she'd ever done. The others were with her. Marcus and the twins, James and the girl whose name Zoe kept forgetting even though they sat next to each other in class. They walked in a line through the ferns and the fallen logs, their yellow vests bright against the gray-green world, and none of them spoke because speaking would have interrupted the song. The trees grew taller here. The moss grew thicker. The light grew dimmer until Zoe could barely see her own hands in front of her face. But that was okay. The whistling would guide her. The whistling would take her where she needed to go. She became aware, gradually, that they were not alone. Shapes moved between the trees, tall shapes thin as branches, their edges blurring into the shadows. They didn't have faces, not exactly. They had places where faces should be, dark spaces that watched without eyes. Zoe wasn't afraid. She should have been afraid. Some distant part of her knew that. But the fear had been packed away somewhere she couldn't reach it, wrapped in the beautiful song and stored in a box she'd forgotten how to open. One of the shapes came closer. It bent down toward her, its not face level with hers, and the darkness where its eyes should be seemed to look into her, through her, past every wall she'd ever built inside herself. It saw everything. Her fears, her hopes, the secret angry thoughts she sometimes had about her little brother, the way she cried at night when she thought about her grandmother who died last spring. It saw all of it, and it didn't judge, and it didn't comfort. It just saw. Then it whistled, a single long note, and Zoe understood that she was being given a choice. She could stay here, in this place between the trees where time didn't work the way it was supposed to, and she would never be afraid again, never be sad, never be anything at all. Or she could go back, carrying what she'd seen, knowing what she now knew, and live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. She tried to speak. She tried to say that she wanted to go home, wanted her mom, wanted to wake up from this dream that had stopped feeling like a dream. But her voice wouldn't work. The song had filled up all the space where words used to live. The shape whistled again. The other shapes whistled in response, a chorus that echoed through the ancient trees, through Zoe's bones, through something deeper than bones. Then there was silence, and then she was sitting in a circle with the other 5 children, in a clearing that shouldn't exist. And a man in a ranger uniform was running toward them with wild eyes and a radio pressed to his mouth. Daniel found them at 11:23, exactly 3 hours after they'd been reported missing. They sat in a perfect circle in a clearing he'd never seen before, despite 11 years of walking these trails. Their yellow vests were spotless, no mud, no moisture, despite the constant rain. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond the visible world. Their hands moved in their laps, fingers tracing the same pattern over and over, a spiral within a spiral, a shape that seemed to turn in on itself forever. None of them spoke. None of them moved except for those tracing fingers. "Dispatch, Ranger Marsh. I've found them, all 6, alive, approximately half a mile north of the Hall of Mosses trail." He gave coordinates that his GPS insisted were accurate, even though they placed him in a location that, according to every map he'd ever seen, was the middle of an impenetrable old-growth thicket. They're unresponsive. I need medical at the visitor center, and I need help carrying them out. They're not walking on their own. As he approached the circle, the closest child, a girl with dark hair and wide, empty eyes, turned her head slowly to look at him. Her lips moved. At first, no sound came out. Then, in a whisper so faint he had to lean in to hear, "They showed us. They showed us what's behind everything." "Who showed you, sweetheart? Who?" "We can't talk about it." Her voice was flat, mechanical, as if she were reciting something memorized long ago. "If we talk about it, they'll hear. They're always listening. The ones who whistle, the ones who wait." She turned away from him, her hands resuming their endless spiral tracing, and she didn't respond to anything else he said. It took 4 rangers to carry the 6 children back to the visitor center. They remained silent the entire way, their eyes open and staring, their fingers still moving in those terrible patterns. Ms. Harper collapsed when she saw them. Paulson had to be restrained from shaking Marcus, demanding to know what happened, where they'd been. The parents were called, ambulances arrived, child psychologists were summoned. And through it all, Daniel kept thinking about the clearing, about how the trees around it had seemed to lean inward, watching, about how the moss on the ground had been pressed flat in a pattern he couldn't quite decipher, about the smell that had hung in the air. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong, like cedar smoke mixed with something older, something that didn't belong to any living thing. And about the whistle he'd heard, just once, as he carried the last child out of the forest, a single note, long and low, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A note that sounded almost like goodbye, or almost like a promise. Dr. Allison Reeves arrived at Olympic Memorial Hospital 3 days later, summoned by a child psychiatry department that had no idea what to do with 6 children who wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat without prompting, and spent every waking moment drawing the same spiral pattern on any surface they could find. She reviewed the case files on the drive from Seattle. Trauma-induced catatonia was her initial hypothesis. Whatever had happened in those 3 hours had been severe enough to trigger a dissociative state in all 6 children simultaneously. It was rare, but not unheard of. Shared trauma could create shared symptoms, but the files included details that didn't fit any pattern she recognized. The children's vitals were perfect. No signs of exposure, dehydration, or physical harm. No evidence of assault. Nothing that should have caused this level of psychological withdrawal. And then there were the drawings. Every child, independently, without seeing each other's work, produced the same image. A spiral within a spiral, rendered with a precision that seemed impossible for children their age. The lines didn't waver. The proportions were mathematically exact. Child psychologists had tested them separately, given them different materials, crayons, markers, pencil, finger paint, and every time, the same spiral emerged. Allison's first interview was with Zoe, the youngest. The girl sat in a hospital room decorated with cheerful animal posters, her hands folded in her lap for once, her eyes focused on Allison's face with an intensity that made the psychiatrist want to look away. "Hello, Zoe. I'm Dr. Reeves. I'm here to talk with you about what happened in the forest." Silence, but not the empty silence of the other children. Zoe was thinking, considering, weighing something behind her 2 old eyes. "You want to know what we saw? I want to help you feel better. We don't feel bad, we feel different." Zoe tilted her head, a gesture that reminded Allison of a bird examining something it might eat. "They didn't hurt us. They just showed us." "Showed you what?" "The space between." Zoe's voice dropped to a whisper. "The place where the trees are always watching. The place where time goes when it's not here. They live there. They've always lived there. Before the forest. Before anything." She paused. "They wanted us to know. They wanted someone to remember." "Remember what, Zoe?" The girl smiled. It was the first expression Allison had seen on any of the children's faces since their return, and it was wrong, too wide, too knowing, a smile that belonged to something much older than 7 years. "That they're still here, that they'll always be here, that sometimes they take people and sometimes they give them back and you can never tell which is worse." She resumed, drawing. The spiral within a spiral, perfect and precise, growing outward from the center of the page. Allison watched her for a long time. Then she closed her notebook and left the room, walking past the nurse's station and out into the hospital parking lot, where she stood in the rain and tried to convince herself that what she'd just seen had a rational explanation. The rain fell soft and constant, the same rain that fell in the Hoh rainforest 30 miles away, where the trees stood ancient and patient and watched with something that wasn't quite awareness, but wasn't quite absence either. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Marcus speaking now, repeating same phrase. "They whistle when they're hungry. They're always hungry. Please advise." Allison didn't respond. She got in her car and drove home, and that night she dreamed of spirals, and in the dream they kept turning inward, 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 until she reached a center that had no bottom. Only darkness, and a sound like whistling that seemed to know her name. The children were released to their families 2 weeks later. The official diagnosis was acute stress reaction, resolved. All 6 eventually resumed normal activities, school, friends, the ordinary business of childhood. But their parents noticed things. Small things at first. The way they sometimes stopped mid-sentence and tilted their heads, listening to something no one else could hear. The way they drew spirals in the margins of their homework, in the frost on windows, in the condensation on bathroom mirrors. The way they never went near forests anymore, any forests, and screamed if anyone tried to make them. And sometimes, late at night, their parents heard them whispering to each other in a language that didn't sound like English, didn't sound like any language at all, a language that sounded almost like whistling. Ranger Daniel Marsh took early retirement the following spring. He moved to Arizona, to a place where the land was flat and open, and you could see for miles in every direction. He never spoke about what happened in the Hoh rainforest, never filed a report that mentioned the things he'd seen in that impossible clearing. But sometimes when the wind blew through the desert at night, he could almost hear it beneath the silence. A long, low note, patient and waiting, that seemed to carry all the way from the moss-covered trees of the Pacific Northwest. They were always listening, the children had said. They were always hungry, and they had all the time in the world to wait. Location: North Cascades National Park, Washington. Date: November 3, 2012. Richard Moran had stopped believing in things he couldn't explain sometime around his 15th year with the Park Service. Before that, he'd entertained the occasional campfire story, the whispered legends that rangers passed down like family heirlooms. But 18 years of working search and rescue in the North Cascades had taught him that the wilderness didn't need supernatural help to kill people. The mountains were indifferent. The cold was patient. Human error was reliable. That was enough. He poured his morning coffee in the Marble Mount Ranger Station, watching the fog roll through the valley like something alive. November had arrived with its usual cruelty, temperatures dropping into the 20s overnight, the first serious snowfall expected by week's end. Most of the seasonal staff had transferred out in October. The park was emptying, settling into its winter solitude. Richard preferred it this way. Fewer visitors meant fewer rescues, fewer body recoveries, fewer families he had to call with news that would shatter their worlds. The station was quiet except for the hum of the space heater and the occasional crackle of the radio. Richard ran through his morning checklist with the ease of long practice. Weather report: overcast, high of 38, snow likely by Tuesday. Trail conditions: Cascade Pass closed above 5,000 feet due to ice. Overnight incidents: none reported. He checked the battery levels on his GPS unit, tested his flashlight, inventoried his pack. These rituals were the liturgy of his profession, the small disciplines that kept men alive when the mountains turned hostile. Outside, the North Cascades rose in jagged silhouette against the gray sky, peaks that the early explorers had called the American Alps, though Richard had always thought that comparison undersold them. The Alps had been civilized for centuries. The North Cascades remained wild in ways that Europe had forgotten. There were valleys here where no human had ever set foot, glaciers that had been grinding stone since before the pyramids were built, forests so dense that sunlight never reached the ground. It was beautiful. It was also utterly indifferent to human survival, and Richard respected that indifference the way a sailor respects the sea. His radio crackled at 0730. Marble Mount Station. This is dispatch. You copy? Richard keyed the mic. Dispatch, Marble Mount. Go ahead. Rich, we've got a situation. Fourth report in 3 weeks of auditory anomalies near Cascade Pass. Hikers hearing what they describe as children crying from the cliff faces. Latest witness is at the Wilderness Information Center, pretty shaken up. Superintendent wants you to interview her, see if we can figure out what's going on. Richard frowned. He'd heard about the first 3 reports, dismissed them as acoustic tricks, the way sound bounced strangely in mountain terrain. Marmots could make sounds eerily similar to human screams. Wind through certain rock formations created whistles and moans. There was always an explanation. Copy that, dispatch. I'll head over now. Any injuries? Negative on injuries, but the witness apparently tried to locate the source and nearly went over a ledge. SAR brought her down last night. She's insistent that what she heard was real. They always are. Marble Mount out. He finished his coffee, grabbed his jacket, and stepped into the cold morning air. The fog was thicker now, reducing visibility to perhaps 100 feet. Somewhere above, hidden by clouds, the mountains waited. The Wilderness Information Center was a 20-minute drive down the highway. Richard found the witness in the staff break room, wrapped in a shock blanket, hands curled around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She was young, late 20s, he guessed, with the weathered look of someone who spent serious time outdoors, not a casual day hiker. Brooke Kavanaugh? He pulled up a chair across from her. I'm Richard Moran, District Ranger. I understand you had an experience up at Cascade Pass. She looked at him with eyes that hadn't slept. You're here to tell me it was marmots, or the wind, or my imagination. I'm here to listen. What happened? Brooke set down her tea. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from cold, Richard noted, but from something deeper. He'd seen that tremor before, in survivors of avalanches, in people who'd watched friends fall. I've been climbing in the Cascades for 6 years, she said. I know what marmots sound like. I know what the wind sounds like. What I heard was not wind. She met his eyes. It was a child, a little girl. She was crying for her mother. Where exactly? On the north face of Johannesburg Mountain, about 200 feet up a vertical cliff. No ledges, no caves, no possible way for anyone to be there, let alone a child. Her voice cracked. But I heard her, clear as I'm hearing you now. She was crying, and then she started calling for help. Please, someone help me, I'm scared, please. Richard wrote in his notebook, keeping his expression neutral. And you attempted to locate the source? Yes, I know how stupid that sounds. But you don't understand. It was so real, so desperate, I kept thinking. What if someone actually fell? What if there's a child up there dying while I stand here doing nothing? She pulled the blanket tighter. I started climbing toward the sound. The crying kept moving, always just a little further up, a little further along the cliff. I followed it for, I don't know, an hour? 2? And then I looked down and realized I was on a ledge about 3 inches wide, 400 feet above the valley floor, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. That's when SR found you? I triggered my emergency beacon. I couldn't move, couldn't go forward, couldn't go back. I just stood there pressed against the rock, waiting. She shuddered. And the whole time, I could still hear her, the little girl. But now she wasn't crying anymore, she was laughing. And the laugh, it wasn't a child's laugh. It was something else. Something that was pretending to be a child, and had stopped pretending because it didn't need to anymore. Richard's pen had stopped moving. He looked at the words he'd written. Laughter, not a child. Pretending. Ms. Kavanaugh, the mind can play tricks. I know what you're going to say. Her voice was flat now, exhausted. And I don't care. I know what I heard. But that's not why I'm telling you this. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. After SAR brought me down, I couldn't sleep. So I started researching, looking for any record of similar incidents in the area. She unfolded the paper. It was a printout from some historical archive, a scanned document, handwritten, dated 1897. This is from a survey report, a geological team mapping the Cascade Pass area. They lost 2 men on Johannesburg Mountain. The report says they followed sounds of distress into impassable terrain and perished in falls. She pointed to a passage circled in red. Read that part. Richard took the paper. The handwriting was cramped, faded, but legible. The native guides refused to continue past the tree line. They spoke of ancient spirits that inhabit the high places, women with the faces of owls who call to travelers with the voices of children. They were adamant that any sound of distress from the cliffs must be ignored, for it is a trap laid by these beings to lure men to their deaths. We dismissed this as superstition. Perhaps we should not have. He read it twice, then a third time. The Yakima and Skagit peoples have been in these mountains for 10,000 years, Brooke said quietly. They know things about this place that we don't, that we've chosen not to know. Richard handed back the paper. His throat felt dry. I'll look into it. You don't believe me. I believe you heard something. He stood. I believe you almost died. Beyond that, I need to see for myself. Brooke's eyes widened. You're going up there? It's my job. Ranger Moran, she grabbed his arm and her grip was surprisingly strong. If you hear a child crying up there, don't follow the sound, promise me. No matter how real it seems, no matter how much you want to help, don't follow. Richard gently removed her hand. I'll be careful. But as he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that careful wasn't going to be enough. He reached the Cascade Pass trailhead at 1100 hours. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the lower slopes of the surrounding peaks, but the summits remained hidden in cloud. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. Snow was definitely coming. Richard signed in at the trail register, more out of habit than regulation since the trail was officially closed, and started up the switchbacks. The forest closed around him immediately. Douglas fir and western red cedar, their trunks massive and dark, their branches interlocking overhead to filter the gray light into something dimmer. The understory was thick with ferns and devil's club, still green despite the season, glistening with moisture. He knew this trail intimately. He'd hiked it perhaps 200 times over 18 years, in every season, every weather condition. He knew where the roots crossed the path, where the mud collected after rain, where the views opened up to reveal the valley below. This was his territory, his home ground. And yet, today, something felt different. It wasn't anything he could name. The forest looked the same. The sounds were the same. The drip of water from branches, the distant call of a raven, the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground. But there was a quality to the silence beneath those sounds that made him uneasy. A sense of being observed, of something paying attention. He reached the pass at 1300 hours. The alpine meadow was brown and dormant, rimmed with the first dustings of snow. Johannesburg Mountain rose to the north, its face a sheer wall of dark rock veined with ice. This was where Brooke had heard the crying. This was where 2 surveyors had died in 1897. Richard stood in the center of the meadow and listened. Wind. Faint. From the northwest. The creak of ice in some distant glacier. A raven, calling from somewhere above. Nothing else. He spent an hour circling the base of the cliff looking for anything that might explain the reports. Acoustic anomalies required specific conditions, rock formations that channeled sound, wind patterns that created resonance. He found nothing unusual. The cliff was simply a cliff, ancient granite, indifferent and silent. By 1430, the light was already fading. November days were short this far north, and the clouds made it worse. Richard decided to make one more circuit before heading down. And that's when he heard it. A child's voice. High and thin and desperate. Hello? Is someone there? Please. I'm scared. It came from above. From the cliff face. From perhaps 200 feet up, exactly where Brooke had described. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. He craned his neck, scanning the rock, looking for any sign of a person, a flash of color, movement, anything. The cliff was empty. A vertical wall of stone with no ledges, no caves, no possible place for anyone to stand. Hello? He called. This is the Park Service. If you can hear me, call out again. Silence. Then, please help me. I can't get down. I'm so cold. The voice was moving. It had been directly above him. Now it seemed to come from further along the cliff, perhaps 100 yards to the east. But the sound quality was wrong. Too clear, too close, as if the speaker were standing right beside him. rather than hundreds of feet up a vertical wall. Don't follow the sound. Brooks' warning echoed in his mind. But Richard Moran had spent 18 years in these mountains. He'd rescued hundreds of people. He'd carried bodies out of places that would haunt him forever. He did not believe in owl women or ancient spirits or supernatural traps. He believed in a child who needed help. He started toward the sound. The voice led him east along the base of the cliff, then up a talus slope that he didn't remember from any of his previous visits. The footing was treacherous, loose rock that shifted under his boots, forcing him to use his hands for balance. The light continued to fade. The temperature continued to drop. "I'm coming," he called. "Keep talking so I can find you." "Over here. Please hurry. It's getting dark." The voice was above him now, somewhere in the mist that had begun to descend. Richard climbed. The rational part of his mind was screaming warnings. This terrain was too unstable, the visibility too poor. He was violating every safety protocol he'd ever learned. But the voice was so real, so afraid, so desperately in need of rescue. He climbed for what felt like hours. The talus gave way to solid rock, then to a narrow ledge that angled upward along the cliff face. He followed it, pressing his back against the stone, inching forward. The drop to his left grew deeper with every step. 300 feet. 400. The valley below had vanished into fog. "Almost there," the voice called. "Just a little further." And then Richard stopped. He stopped because the ledge had ended. He stood on a platform of rock perhaps 4 feet wide, surrounded on 3 sides by vertical cliff, and on the 4th by empty air. There was nowhere else to go, no way forward, and no child. "Hello?" His voice came out hoarse. "Where are you?" Laughter answered, high and musical and utterly wrong. It came from everywhere at once, from the rock beneath his feet, from the mist around him, from inside his own skull. Poor little man. The voice was different now, deeper, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking in imperfect unison. "You followed so well. They always follow. The ones who think they can help. The ones who think they know these mountains." Something moved in the mist above him. Richard looked up. She descended slowly, emerging from the fog like something born from it. Her body was that of a woman, tall, impossibly tall, wrapped in feathers the color of dried blood. Her arms ended in hands with fingers too long, too jointed. Her face was an owl's face. Enormous amber eyes with pupils that contracted to pinpoints as they fixed on him. A hooked beak where a mouth should be, feathered tufts rising from her head like horns. But the worst part was the familiarity. The way her head tilted as she regarded him, curious, amused. The intelligence in those alien eyes, not animal, not human, something far older than either. 18 years, she said. And the voice was suddenly his mother's voice. His mother, who had died when he was 22. His mother calling him Richie the way only she ever did. 18 years walking our mountains. We've watched you, Richie. We've waited. We knew eventually you'd hear us calling. You're not real. His voice cracked. You're not real. She laughed again, and now the laugh was a child's giggle, innocent and terrible. Ask the surveyors. Ask all the others who climbed toward voices they couldn't resist. Their bones are here, Richie, deep in the rocks. We keep them. We remember them. She floated closer. Her wingspan was impossible, 20 feet at least, feathers rustling with a sound like whispered secrets. The cold radiating from her was deeper than winter, deeper than anything the mountains could produce. It was the cold of places between. We could take you now, she said, and the voice shifted to Brooks' voice, perfect and precise. We could add you to our collection, but that's not why we called you here. Richard pressed himself against the rock. His legs wouldn't move. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every survival instinct he'd developed over 18 years was screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something. But there was nowhere to run, nothing to fight, nothing to do but stand and listen. Why? he managed. The owl woman smiled. A beak shouldn't be able to smile, but hers did, splitting wide to reveal a throat that went down forever, into darkness that seemed to move. To deliver a message. She leaned close, and her breath smelled of pine and rot, and something older than stone. The mountains are waking. The old agreements are ending. For 10,000 years we took only those who followed, those who chose to climb toward us. But the boundaries are thinning, Richard Moran. Soon we won't need to call. Soon we'll come down from the high places. And when we do... She tilted her head, owl-like, curious. "Tell them," she whispered. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them to remember the old stories. Tell them that what sleeps in the peaks is stirring." And then she was gone. No transition, no departure. Simply there one moment and absent the next, leaving only the mist and the cold and the impossible ledge where Richard stood, 400 feet above the valley floor, with no memory of how he'd climbed so high. Search and rescue found him at 300 hours, huddled on the ledge, hypothermic and unresponsive. They had to airlift him out by helicopter. There was no safe way to climb down in the dark, and no explanation for how he'd reached that position in the first place. The rescue team leader said later that the ledge Richard was on shouldn't have been accessible without technical climbing gear. The route he'd apparently taken didn't exist. Richard spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from exposure. He told the doctors he'd gotten lost in the fog. He told the superintendent he'd slipped and become stranded. He told his colleagues nothing at all. But he wrote a report. A real report. One that would never be filed officially. One that he sealed in an envelope and placed in his personal safe deposit box, along with his will and his service records. The report detailed everything. Brooks' account, the historical documents, what he'd seen on that ledge. He didn't expect anyone to believe it. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. But in March of the following year, a hiker disappeared near Cascade Pass. Her body was never found. The search teams reported hearing a child crying from the cliffs, a voice that moved when they followed, that led them toward increasingly dangerous terrain until their commander ordered a retreat. And in November 2013, exactly 1 year after Richard's encounter, 3 climbers vanished on Johannesburg Mountain. The weather had been clear. Their equipment was found at their campsite, neatly arranged as if they'd simply walked away in the middle of the night. The last entry in their logbook read, "Heard something outside the tent. Sounds like a little girl crying. Going to check." Richard read the incident reports. He visited the memorial plaques that the families installed at the trailhead. He said nothing to anyone because what was there to say? That the mountains were haunted? That owl women lived in the high places and called to travelers with the voices of children? That something ancient was stirring and the old protections were failing? No one would believe him. He barely believed himself, but he never hiked to Cascade Pass again. He requested a transfer to a desert park, anywhere without peaks that vanished into mist, without cliffs that echoed with impossible sounds. The request was denied, and every November when the first snows came and the nights grew long, Richard would lie awake in his cabin and listen. Listen for the sound of crying from the mountains. Listen for a voice calling his name in the darkness. Sometimes, just before dawn, he thought he heard her. "Richie. Come find me, Richie. I've been waiting so long." His mother's voice. Perfect, and patient, and hungry. He would pull the covers over his head and wait for daylight. But daylight came later every year and the nights grew longer. And somewhere in the peaks above the tree line, something was watching. Something that remembered his name. Something that had all the time in the world. Location, Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. Date, October 19, 2022. The first thing Christopher Vance did every morning was check his camera traps. He'd been photographing wildlife in the Appalachians for 23 years, and the ritual had become as automatic as breathing. Wake before dawn, drink coffee black from a thermos that had seen better decades, pull on boots that knew the shape of his feet better than he did, and walk the circuit. 12 cameras spread across 3 square miles of Shenandoah backcountry, each one positioned to capture the secret lives of animals that most visitors never saw. Black bears rubbing against marking trees, bobcats padding through moonlit clearings, the occasional coyote, increasingly common these days, moving through the forest like gray smoke, and deer. Always deer. White-tailed deer were so abundant in Shenandoah that most photographers didn't bother with them anymore. Too common, too easy, too familiar. But Christopher had built his reputation on finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, a buck mid-leap, muscles straining, antlers catching the first light of dawn, a doe nursing twin fawns in a meadow of wildflowers. Deer weren't boring. People just stopped looking at them carefully. Christopher never stopped looking carefully. That was his gift, and as it turned out, his curse. The morning of October 19th was cold enough to see his breath, the kind of Appalachian autumn morning where the fog settled into the hollows and the ridges emerged above it like islands in a white sea. The trees along Skyline Drive had turned that particular shade of orange and red that brought tourists from 3 states away, their cars crawling along the scenic overlooks, their phones held up to capture something they'd forget by next week. Christopher avoided the drive when he could. His work happened in the spaces between, the unmarked trails and game paths that led deeper into the forest where the land still remembered what it was before the roads came. He was checking camera 7, positioned near a seasonal creek that deer used as a travel corridor, when he found the first image that didn't make sense. The camera had triggered at 3:47 a.m., capturing a burst of 6 frames in rapid succession. The first 5 showed nothing unusual: empty forest, the creek a dark ribbon at the bottom of the frame, the trees silver in the infrared flash. But the 6th frame had a deer in it, a buck, young, maybe 2 years old based on the antler development, standing in the creek bed facing the camera. Facing the camera. Christopher stared at the image on the camera's small LCD screen, trying to understand what he was seeing. Deer didn't face cameras. They didn't face anything directly unless they were about to charge. Their eyes were on the sides of their heads precisely because they were prey animals, built to watch for threats from every direction. A deer facing forward like this, head-on, eyes aimed straight at the lens. He zoomed in. The image quality degraded, pixels blurring, but he could still see enough to know that something was wrong. The eyes were too far forward, almost on the front of the face, like a predator's eyes, and the mouth. Was the mouth open? It was hard to tell at this resolution. It looked like the deer was smiling. Christopher pulled the SD card and pocketed it. His hands were shaking slightly, and he told himself it was the cold. Madison Calloway had worked the front desk at the Big Meadows Lodge for 3 seasons, and she'd heard every variety of tourist complaint imaginable. The rooms were too rustic, the Wi-Fi was too slow, the bears had gotten into the trash again. But the complaint she received that morning was new. "There's a deer outside my cabin," the woman said. She was maybe 60, silver-haired, wearing the kind of expensive hiking gear that suggested she'd never actually hiked anywhere. "It won't leave." "Ma'am, deer are very common in the park if you just ignore it." "I've been ignoring it for 6 hours." The woman's voice had an edge to it now, something beyond annoyance. Something that sounded almost like fear. "It was there when I went to sleep last night. It was there when I woke up. It hasn't moved. It just stands there, staring at my window." Madison walked with her to cabin 7, expecting to find nothing. Deer didn't stand in one place for 6 hours. But when they rounded the corner of the maintenance building, she stopped. The woman hadn't been exaggerating. There was a deer standing approximately 15 feet from the cabin's front window. A doe. Medium-sized, unremarkable in every way except for its absolute unnatural stillness. It wasn't grazing, it wasn't looking around. It was simply standing, facing the window, as motionless as a photograph. "See?" the woman whispered. "It's been like that all night. It's not normal, it's not..." She stopped, swallowed. "There's something wrong with it. Something wrong with the way it looks at you." Madison approached the deer slowly, the way she'd been trained. "Hey there," she called, clapping her hands. "Shoo, Go on. The deer didn't move. She got closer, 10 feet, 8. Close enough now to see the details, the texture of the fur, the subtle rise and fall of breathing, the large, dark eyes that were fixed on the cabin window with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She clapped again, louder. Go, get out of here. The deer turned its head, not its body, just its head, rotating on its neck with a smooth, mechanical motion that no deer should have been capable of. It looked at Madison, and Madison, for reasons she couldn't explain, felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. She didn't run. She stood her ground, her heart hammering, as the deer held her gaze for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Then it turned, all at once, body and head together, and walked into the forest. Not bounded, not fled, walked, with a deliberate, almost human gait, each leg lifting and placing itself with unnatural precision. Thank you, the woman said, her voice weak with relief. Thank you. I thought I was going crazy. Madison nodded, but she wasn't looking at the woman. She was looking at the tree line where the deer had vanished, because just before it disappeared into the shadows, she could have sworn it turned its head back and looked at her one more time, and smiled. Christopher found the second anomalous image that afternoon. He'd gone back to his cabin to review the footage on his laptop, where the larger screen might reveal details he'd missed on the camera's tiny display. The image was even worse than he'd feared. The deer's eyes were definitely too far forward, not by much, maybe an inch or two from where they should have been, but enough to transform the animal's face from something familiar into something deeply, fundamentally wrong. And the mouth was open. The lips were pulled back. Not in a pant, not in the way deer sometimes breathed with their mouths open after exertion. This was different. This was teeth being displayed, being shown. He called the park's wildlife management office and asked to speak with whoever handled disease reports. A woman named Dr. Chen came on the line, and Christopher described what he'd captured. Forward-facing eyes? She sounded skeptical. That's not possible. That would require a complete restructuring of the skull. I know what deer look like. I've photographed thousands of them. This isn't a normal deer. Could be a genetic abnormality, or a trick of the light, the angle of the camera. Can you send me the file? He emailed her the image and waited. The silence on the line stretched for 30 seconds. A minute. When Dr. Chen spoke again, her voice had changed. Where did you take this? Camera trap near the White Oak Canyon Trail. Why? Another pause. Mr. Vance, I'm going to be honest with you. We've had reports over the past few weeks. Hikers seeing deer that behave strangely. A family claimed one followed their car for 3 miles down Skyline Drive. A backpacker said he saw a deer standing on its hind legs in a clearing, but when he tried to photograph it, his phone died. She exhaled slowly. I've been dismissing them as misidentification, overactive imaginations. But this image, what about it? I've been looking at it for 60 seconds and I can't make myself believe it's a deer. I know it's a deer, it has to be a deer, but every time I look at it, something in my brain just rejects it, like it's the wrong shape for reality. Christopher looked at his laptop screen. The image stared back at him. Those eyes. That mouth. I'm going back tonight, he said, to camera 7. I'm going to see what's out there. Mr. Vance, I don't think that's a good idea. Maybe not. But I need to know. I need to see it with my own eyes. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Dr. Chen said something that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. What if seeing it is exactly what it wants? The forest was different at night. Christopher had spent countless hours in these woods after dark, patient and still, waiting for the perfect shot. He knew the sounds. The rustle of small mammals in the leaf litter, the distant call of barred owls, the occasional crack of a branch as deer moved through the understory. He knew the smells. Decomposing leaves, damp earth, the faint musk of animals passing through. He knew the way moonlight filtered through the canopy, turning everything silver and shadow. Tonight, The forest was silent. He'd reached Camera 7's location just after sunset, settling into a spot behind a fallen oak where he could watch the creek bed without being seen. His camera was ready, a professional DSLR with a low-light lens that could capture detail in near-total darkness. His phone was in his pocket, set to record audio. If something came, he would document it. That's what he did. That's who he was. The silence was the first wrong thing. No insects, no owls, no rustle of wind through the dying leaves, just absolute suffocating quiet, as if the forest had drawn a breath and forgotten to let it out. Christopher checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. He'd been here for almost 2 hours. Nothing had moved. Nothing had made a sound. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not deer footsteps. Too regular, too rhythmic, too deliberate. These were footsteps that wanted to be heard. They came from somewhere to his left, moving parallel to the creek, getting closer. Christopher raised his camera, his finger hovering over the shutter button, his eye pressed to the viewfinder. The shape that emerged from the darkness was a deer. A buck. Young. 2-point antlers. It walked into the creek bed and stopped, exactly where the deer in the photograph had been standing. And then it turned to face him. Christopher's finger froze on the shutter button. Through the viewfinder, he could see it clearly now. The eyes positioned wrong, too far forward, fixed on his hiding spot with a predator's focus. The mouth slightly open, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too flat, too square, too much like human teeth. The head tilted at an angle that should have been anatomically impossible, cocked to one side like a curious dog, except there was nothing curious about that stare. It was calculating, appraising. It knew he was there. It had always known. Christopher took the photo. The shutter clicked, and in the instant of the flash, he saw the thing's true face. Not a deer at all, not really, but something wearing the shape of a deer, the way a person might wear an ill-fitting suit. The proportions were wrong everywhere, the legs too long, the neck too flexible, the body somehow too thin and too full at the same time. And the eyes, caught in the flash's glare, weren't reflecting light. They were generating it, a faint internal glow that had nothing to do with the camera's flash. The thing smiled. There was no other word for it. The mouth stretched wider than any deer's mouth could stretch, the lips pulling back past the gums, past the jaw, the expression spreading across the face like a wound opening. Christopher ran. He didn't remember the route he took, didn't remember pushing through branches or stumbling over roots or the burning in his lungs as he sprinted blindly through the darkness. He remembered only the sound behind him. Those footsteps, those deliberate, measured footsteps, keeping pace with him exactly, never falling behind, never getting closer. Following. Herding. He burst out of the tree line onto Skyline Drive just as a car came around the curve, its headlights washing over him. The car swerved, honked, kept going. Christopher stood in the middle of the road, gasping, his camera still clutched in his white-knuckled hands. The forest behind him was silent. The footsteps had stopped. But at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the distant streetlights, something stood, watching him. A deer. Just a deer. Completely normal. Completely still. It looked at him for a long moment. Then it turned and walked back into the darkness, and Christopher Vance finally let himself scream. He checked the camera the next morning. The photo he'd taken, the one with the flash, the one that had shown the thing's true face, was corrupted, just a blur of pixels and static, unrecoverable. But the camera trap had kept recording after he fled. The motion sensor had triggered 6 more times throughout the night, capturing 6 more images. Every single one showed the same thing. The creek bed, empty. The trees still. And at the very edge of every frame, just barely visible, a shape that might have been a deer standing in the shadows, watching. The last image was time-stamped 6:23 a.m., 20 minutes after sunrise. In that image, the shape was closer, much closer. Close enough that Christopher could make out the outline of antlers, the curve of a neck. the gleam of eyes that seemed to be looking directly at the camera, directly at him. He deleted the images, pulled all 12 cameras from the forest, packed his equipment, checked out of his cabin, drove down the mountain without stopping, without looking back, without allowing himself to glance at the dozens of deer grazing peacefully along Skyline Drive. But he knows it doesn't matter. He knows because of what Madison Calloway told him when he stopped at the lodge to settle his bill. She'd looked pale, exhausted, her hands trembling as she processed his credit card. "Did you see it?" she whispered. "The thing that's not a deer?" He nodded. "It knows," she said. "When you see it, really see it, it knows. And then it follows you." She glanced out the window at the tree line, at the shadows between the trunks. "I've seen it every day since, standing outside my apartment, walking through the parking lot, always watching, always smiling." Christopher drove home to Richmond that night. He lives on the 4th floor of an apartment building with no trees nearby, no forest, no wildlife. He doesn't photograph animals anymore. He doesn't go outside after dark. But sometimes in the gray hours before dawn, he looks out his window at the empty street below. And sometimes there's a shape standing on the sidewalk. A deer perfectly still, perfectly normal, looking up at his window with eyes that catch the streetlight and glow. It hasn't come closer. Not yet. But every morning it's a little bit nearer than it was the night before. Location: Glacier Bay National Park, Alaska. Date: August 28, 2012. Walter Erickson was 67 years old and had been retired from the Park Service for 5 years when the phone call came. He was in his workshop behind the house in Juneau, sanding the hull of a kayak he'd been building for his grandson, when his wife appeared in the doorway with the cordless phone and an expression he couldn't read. "It's the park," she said. "Glacier Bay. They say it's important." He set down the sandpaper and took the phone, stepping outside into the gray August morning. The air smelled of rain and spruce, the familiar scent of southeast Alaska that had been home for 40 years now. "This is Walter Erickson." "Mr. Erickson, this is Superintendent Davies at Glacier Bay. I apologize for disturbing your retirement, but we have a situation that, frankly, sir, I don't know how to explain it. We need you to come to the park." Walter leaned against the workshop wall. In 23 years with the Park Service, the last 15 at Glacier Bay, he'd handled every kind of situation imaginable: rescues, recoveries, bear attacks, drownings, hypothermia cases, lost hikers, crashed planes. Nothing in Davies's voice suggested any of those familiar emergencies. "What kind of situation?" A long pause. Static on the line, or maybe just the superintendent gathering himself. "Sir, do you remember a missing persons case from 1987? A kayaker named Keith Hartwell who disappeared in Muir Inlet?" Walter's hand tightened on the phone. Of course he remembered. 25 years, and he still remembered every detail. Keith Hartwell, 35 years old, experienced kayaker from Seattle, went out for a day paddle on August 15, 1987, and never came back. Walter had led the search personally. 14 days, dozens of personnel, aircraft, boats, everything they had. They'd found the kayak drifting near McBride Glacier, empty and undamaged. They'd never found Keith Hartwell. "I remember," Walter said. "Mr. Erickson, we found him." "You found his remains?" Another pause. Longer this time. "No, sir. We found him. Alive. This morning. A tour boat spotted a kayaker drifting in Muir Inlet, picked him up, brought him to park headquarters. He's sitting in our infirmary right now. His ID says Keith Hartwell. His equipment is from 1987, and he hasn't aged a day." Walter said nothing. The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, syllables that refused to assemble into anything coherent. "Sir, he's asking for the ranger who led the search for him. He says he spoke with you the morning he launched. He remembers your name. He thinks..." Davies's voice cracked slightly. He thinks it's still 1987. He thinks he's only been gone a few hours. The phone felt heavy in Walter's hand. The gray sky pressed down. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called, a harsh laughing sound that echoed off the mountains. "I'll be on the next ferry," Walter said. The journey to Glacier Bay took 7 hours by fast ferry from Juneau. Walter spent most of it on the outer deck, watching the coastline slide past. The same coastline he'd patrolled for 15 years. The same forested islands and rocky headlands and distant glaciers calving ice into frigid water. He'd thought he knew this place. He'd thought he understood its dangers. Now he wasn't sure he understood anything. He remembered August 15th, 1987, with the clarity that only certain days achieve in memory. It had been unusually warm, the sun bright on the water, the glaciers gleaming under blue sky. Keith Hartwell had arrived at the Bartlett Cove Ranger Station at 07:30, a tall man with sun-bleached hair and the easy confidence of someone who'd spent years in wild places. He'd filed his float plan, checked in his emergency beacon, chatted with Walter about the best routes to see the Tidewater glaciers. "I've been coming to Alaska for 10 years, he'd said. But Glacier Bay, there's something different about this place. The way the light hits the ice, the silence, it's like paddling through a dream." Walter had nodded, stamped his permit, wished him well. Standard procedure, routine interaction. He'd been the last person to see Keith Hartwell alive, or so he'd thought, for 25 years. The search had been one of the most extensive in Glacier Bay's history. They'd covered every inch of Muir Inlet, sent divers into the frigid water near where the kayak was found, interviewed everyone who'd been in the area that day. Nothing. No body. No wreckage. No explanation. Keith Hartwell had simply vanished, as if the glacier had swallowed him whole. Walter had written the final report himself. Subject presumed drowned. Body not recovered. Case closed pending new evidence. Now apparently there was new evidence, sitting in the park infirmary, asking for him by name. Superintendent Davies met him at the Bartlett Cove dock. He was a young man, younger than Walter's own son, with the look of someone who hadn't slept and wasn't sure he'd ever sleep again. "Thank you for coming, sir. I know this is unusual." "Has he been examined? Medically?" "Yes. Dr. Chen flew in from Juneau this morning. Physically, he's in perfect health. No signs of exposure, dehydration, malnutrition. Nothing you'd expect from someone who's been wherever he's been. His vital signs are normal. His cognitive function is normal. He knows his name, his address, his social security number. He knows who the president is, except he thinks it's Reagan." They walked along the dock toward the visitor center. Tourists milled about, oblivious to anything strange, taking photos of the mountains and the glaciers visible in the distance, the mundane continuing while the impossible sat in a building 50 yards away. "Has he said anything about what happened? Where he's been?" Davies shook his head. He doesn't understand the question. As far as he's concerned, he went out paddling this morning, got caught in some fog near McBride Glacier, lost his bearings, and then a tour boat picked him up. He keeps asking why everyone's making such a fuss. They reached the infirmary, a small building near the ranger station, used mostly for treating minor injuries and seasickness from the tour boats. Davies stopped at the door. "Sir, I have to warn you. When you see him, it's exactly the photo from the 1987 file. Exactly. Same clothes, same watch, same haircut. The park historian pulled some old newspapers. There's a picture of him from before he disappeared. It's the same man. Not similar. The same." Walter took a breath. "Let me see him." Keith Hartwell sat on the edge of an examination table, wearing a fleece jacket that Walter recognized. It was a brand that hadn't been manufactured since 1992. His kayaking gear was piled in the corner. A fiberglass paddle, a spray skirt, a PFD with the logo of a Seattle outfitter that had gone out of business in 1995. Everything looked new. Everything looked like it had been purchased yesterday. And the man himself, Walter had been a ranger for over 2 decades. He'd seen bodies in every state of decay. He'd seen drowning victims and avalanche victims and people who'd been dead so long they were barely recognizable as human. But he had never seen anything that made him question his understanding of reality until this moment. Keith Hartwell looked exactly as he had 25 years ago. Not similar, not well preserved. Exactly. The same laugh lines around his eyes, the same small scar on his chin, the same way he tilted his head when he was thinking. He hadn't aged a single day. Ranger Erickson? Keith's face lit up with recognition. Good to see you again. Listen, I'm sorry for all this trouble. I must have drifted further than I thought. But I'm fine, really. If someone could just point me back to my car, I'll get out of your hair. Walter sat down in the chair across from him. His legs weren't entirely steady. Keith, what's today's date? August 15th. No, wait. He checked his watch. The 16th, maybe? I was out longer than I planned. Sarah's probably wondering where I am. She worries, you know how it is. Who's Sarah? My wife. We're staying at the lodge in Gustavus. She wanted to come kayaking, but she's got a cold. I told her I'd just do a day trip, be back by dinner. He frowned. What time is it? I should really call her. Walter felt something cold settling in his chest. He remembered Sarah Hartwell. He'd been the one to notify her when the search was called off. She'd stood in the ranger station, this very building, and asked him over and over if there was any chance at all, that her husband was still alive. He told her no. He told her the cold water, the remoteness, the time elapsed. There was no chance. She'd collapsed against the wall and made a sound that Walter had never forgotten, a sound like something breaking that would never be fixed. Sarah Hartwell had remarried in 1992. She'd moved to Oregon. She had 2 grown children now from her second marriage. She was 63 years old. The man in front of Walter thought he was going to call her for dinner. Keith, Walter said carefully. What year is it? What year? Keith laughed. What kind of question is that? It's 1987. Are you feeling okay? Keith, it's not 1987. It's 2012. August 28th, 2012. You've been missing for 25 years. The laughter died. Keith's face went through several expressions: confusion, amusement, concern, then something else. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding, and the terror that came with it. That's not funny. That's a really weird joke, man. It's not a joke. Walter pulled out his phone. A smartphone, a technology that hadn't existed when Keith launched his kayak. He opened the calendar, showed it to Keith. Look at the date. Look at this device. This is a telephone, and a camera, and a computer. Things have changed, Keith. A lot of things have changed. Keith stared at the phone. His hands were trembling now. I was only gone for a few hours. I saw the glacier, took some photos, and then the fog came in. Just fog. It was everywhere, and I couldn't see the shore, and then... He stopped. His eyes went distant, focusing on something Walter couldn't see. And then what? There was something in the fog. Keith's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. Shapes. Moving. They didn't have faces, but I could feel them looking at me. And one of them touched my kayak. Just a hand, not a hand, something like a hand, on the bow. And everything went gray. And then it was clear again, and I could see the mountains, and I thought I'd just lost a few minutes. I thought the fog had lifted. But the glacier... What about the glacier? It was different. Smaller. McBride Glacier, it was right there when I paddled in, and when the fog cleared, it was further away, like it had retreated, like years had passed. He looked at Walter with eyes that were beginning to accept the impossible. 25 years? 25 years. Keith made a sound. Not a scream, not quite a sob, but something between them. The sound of a man watching his entire life disappear. Sarah, he whispered. My parents, my job, my house, my entire life. It's all gone? Walter didn't answer. There was no answer to give. The next few days were a bureaucratic nightmare. What do you do with a man who's been legally dead for 2 decades? Keith Hartwell's social security number had been closed. His bank accounts had been distributed to his estate. His house had been sold. Everyone who'd known him had mourned him and moved on. Walter stayed at the park, helping where he could, watching Keith struggle to absorb the enormity of what had happened. The press got wind of the story. Of course they did. And suddenly Glacier Bay was swarming with reporters and paranormal investigators and curious tourists who wanted to see the man who'd traveled through time. But it wasn't time travel. Walter knew that, even if he couldn't explain how he knew. Keith hadn't traveled to the future. He'd been somewhere else. Somewhere outside of time, where 25 years and 25 minutes were the same thing. On the 3rd day, Walter found Keith sitting on the dock at Bartlett Cove staring out at the water. The tourists had been kept away, but a few sea otters floated nearby, indifferent to human tragedy. "I tried to call Sarah," Keith said. "My Sarah, the woman I married, but she's someone else now, older, different life, different family. She said she was glad I was alive, but she said it like she was talking to a ghost, which I guess I am." Walter sat down beside him. The dock creaked under their weight. "Do you remember anything else? About the fog? The shapes you saw?" Keith was quiet for a long moment. "The Tlingit guide who brought supplies to the tour boat yesterday. He wouldn't look at me. I asked one of the rangers why, and she said he'd told her I'd been taken by the shadow people. The Ijirak, he called them. He said sometimes they give people back, but they're never the same after. Are you the same?" Keith turned to look at him, and Walter saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there in 1987. Something old, something that had seen things human eyes weren't meant to see. "No," Keith said simply. "No, I'm not." "What was it like, the place where you were?" I can't describe it. It was like being everywhere and nowhere at once. Like standing outside of time and watching it flow past like a river. I could see my whole life laid out like a road on a map. Every moment I'd ever lived, every moment I was supposed to live. And then I was back here, and all those moments were gone, spent without me. 25 years that happened to everyone except me." He picked up a stone from the dock and threw it into the water. It vanished without a ripple. "The worst part," he said, "is that I don't feel like I lost 25 years. I feel like I lost a few hours, but everyone I love has lost me for a quarter of a century. My mother died thinking I was dead. My father remarried. My brother has kids I've never met. The world kept going, and I wasn't in it. And I don't know how to exist in a place that moved on without me." Walter thought about the search he'd led, the divers in the frigid water, the helicopters circling the glaciers, the hope that diminished with each passing day until it was gone entirely. "We looked for you," he said. "For 2 weeks we looked. Every day I told myself we'd find you, and then we didn't. And I had to tell your wife that you were gone. I know, I don't blame you. How could you have found me? I wasn't anywhere you could look." They sat in silence. The otters dove and surfaced, The glaciers gleamed in the distance, ancient and patient, keeping whatever secrets they kept. "What will you do now?" Walter asked. "I don't know. I don't know if there's anything to do. I'm a dead man who came back, and the world doesn't have a place for me anymore." Keith stood, brushed off his pants. The same pants he'd been wearing in 1987, still somehow new. "But I'll tell you one thing, Ranger Erickson. Whatever took me, whatever those things were in the fog, they're still out there. In the places where the world gets thin, in the fog and the ice and the spaces between moments, and they're not done." "How do you know?" Keith turned to look at the glaciers. His eyes were very far away. "Because when they let me go, I heard them. Not words, they don't use words. But I understood anyway. They said I was a message, a reminder." He paused. "They said more would follow." Walter returned to Juneau that evening. He hugged his wife for a long time, and she didn't ask why. He finished building the kayak for his grandson, and he never told him about Keith Hartwell. But sometimes, when the fog came in thick from the water and the world went gray and silent, Walter would stand at his window and remember. He would think about the places where time ran differently, where 25 years could pass in an afternoon, where things without faces reached out from the mist and took people away. Keith Hartwell eventually left Alaska. The last Walter heard, he was living somewhere in New Mexico in the desert, as far from water and fog and glaciers as a man could get. He never married again, never reconnected with his family in any meaningful way. He existed in the world, but not quite of it, a man out of time in every sense. And at Glacier Bay, the glaciers continued their slow retreat, revealing land that had been buried for centuries. Tour boats brought visitors to see the ice and the wildlife and the terrible beauty of a landscape being transformed. Sometimes, the guide said, the fog came in quickly near McBride Glacier. Sometimes passengers reported seeing shapes in the mist, figures that moved wrong, that flickered at the edges of vision. Sometimes people heard voices calling from the fog, asking for help, asking to be found. The Park Service had a protocol now. When the fog came in at Muir Inlet, all boats returned to Bartlett Cove. No exceptions. They never explained why. But Walter knew, and in his nightmares, he saw it. The fog rolling in, thick and gray and alive, and in the fog, shapes without faces, reaching, waiting, patient as glaciers, old as the ice itself. He would wake in the darkness, heart pounding, and check the date on his phone. Make sure it was still 2012. Make sure he hadn't lost any time. Make sure he was still where and when he was supposed to be. So far, he always was. But every morning when he checked, there was a moment, just a moment, when he wasn't entirely sure. And in that moment, the fog seemed very close. Location: Wind Cave National Park, South Dakota. Date: September 22, 2019. The prairie grass moved like water in the pre-dawn light, endless waves of gold and brown rolling toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. Morgan Alcott stood at the edge of the Wind Cave Visitor Center parking lot, coffee steaming in her hands, watching the sunrise paint the black hills in shades of amber and rose. 7 years with the National Park Service, the last 3 at Wind Cave, and she still hadn't gotten used to the scale of this place. The sky here was bigger than anywhere she'd ever lived. It made you feel small in ways that were sometimes comforting and sometimes terrifying. Her radio crackled at 6:15, breaking the morning silence. "Morgan, you copy? It's Jim at the ranger station. We've got a situation." She keyed her response. "Go ahead, Jim. Sheriff's Department found a body about 2 miles east of the park boundary, near that old access road by the Sanson Ranch. Male, maybe mid-30s. They're saying it looks like he was trampled. Asking if we've had any bison incidents reported." Morgan frowned. Bison attacks happened. The park's herd was wild, and tourists who got too close sometimes learned painful lessons. But 2 miles outside the boundary was unusual. The animals rarely wandered that far from the prairie dog towns that provided their preferred grazing. "Any witnesses?" "Negative. Ranch hand found him this morning. Sheriff Dawson's requesting Park Service assistance since it might be wildlife related. Can you head out there?" "On my way." She drove east on Highway 385, then turned onto a gravel road that wound through ranch land dotted with cattle and the occasional pronghorn. The Black Hills rose to the north, dark with ponderosa pine, while to the south the prairie stretched flat and golden toward Nebraska. It was beautiful country, harsh and honest in ways that cities never were. Morgan had come here after a decade in Denver, burned out on urban life, seeking something she couldn't quite name. She'd found it in the silence of the cave tours, the patience of the bison herds, the ancient rhythms of a landscape that didn't care about human schedules or human problems. The crime scene was marked by 2 sheriff's vehicles and an ambulance that clearly wasn't going anywhere fast. Morgan parked and walked toward the cluster of uniforms, her boots crunching on dry grass. Sheriff Dawson, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much, met her halfway. Ranger Alcott. Thanks for coming. He gestured toward a shape covered by a yellow tarp about 50 yards off the road. Name's Travis Hendricks, 34. Worked at the grain elevator in Hot Springs. His truck's parked about a quarter-mile back. Looks like he was walking home from somewhere. The Rusty Spur? Morgan knew the bar. Everyone knew the bar. It was the only watering hole within 20 miles, a weathered wooden building that catered to ranchers, park employees, and the occasional lost tourist. That'd be my guess. We're checking with the owner. Dawson's expression was troubled. Here's the thing, though. I've seen bison attacks. Hell, I've seen cattle stampedes. This doesn't look like either. Morgan approached the tarp and knelt beside it. Dawson nodded to one of his deputies who pulled back the covering. Travis Hendricks had been a large man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, the kind of build that came from manual labor and cheap beer. Now he was broken. His chest was caved in, his face a ruin of shattered bone, his arms bent at angles that made Morgan's stomach lurch. But it was the hoof prints that made her go still. They covered his body, dozens of them, pressed deep into flesh and fabric alike. But they weren't bison prints. Too small, too delicate. These were the prints of a deer. A single deer, from the pattern of it, striking the same target over and over with a precision that spoke of intention rather than panic. You see what I mean? Dawson said quietly. Deer don't do this. Deer run away. They don't hunt, Morgan finished. She stood, her mind racing. Any other tracks? Signs of a vehicle, another person? Just his footprints coming from the road. And hers. Hers? Dawson pointed to a line of impressions in the dust leading away from the body. Morgan followed them with her eyes. High heels. Delicate, narrow, the kind of shoes no one would wear on a South Dakota gravel road. They led about 30 feet from the body and then simply stopped as if the woman wearing them had stepped off the edge of the earth. And beside those heel prints, parallel to them, something else. Hoof prints, deer hoof prints, walking in perfect sync with the woman's shoes. Morgan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I need to make some calls, she said. Travis Hendricks hadn't meant to stay so late at the Rusty Spur. He'd come in around 8 for a beer and a burger, planning to be home by 10. But then he'd seen her. She was sitting alone at the end of the bar, a woman so beautiful she seemed to glow in the dim light. Dark hair falling past her shoulders, eyes that caught the neon and threw it back in colors he couldn't name. A white dress that clung to curves that made his mouth go dry. She smiled at him, and something in his chest cracked open like a door he'd forgotten existed. He bought her a drink. She accepted. They talked, or rather he talked, the words spilling out of him like water from a broken dam. He told her about his job, his truck, his plans. He didn't tell her about Melissa, his ex-wife, or the restraining order she'd filed last spring, or the way her face had looked the last time he'd seen her, purple and swollen from his fists. He didn't tell her about the other women before Melissa, the ones who'd learned not to talk back, not to question, not to make him angry. He didn't tell her, but somehow, looking into those impossible eyes, he felt like she already knew. "Dance with me," she said. There was no jukebox playing, no music at all. But when she stood and held out her hand, Travis heard something, a rhythm just beneath the threshold of hearing, drums and footsteps and heartbeats all woven together. They danced, in the parking lot, under stars that seemed brighter than they should have been. They moved together in patterns Travis didn't recognize. She was warm against him, smelling of prairie flowers and something else, something wild and ancient and dangerous. Her dress swirled around her legs as they turned. Her legs. Something was wrong with her legs. "Don't look down," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "Just dance with me, Travis. Dance with me until the song ends." But he looked. He couldn't help it. Below the hem of her white dress, where there should have been feet in delicate shoes, there were hooves, black and polished and sharp as knives. They clicked against the gravel with each step, leaving crescents pressed into the earth. Travis screamed. He tried to pull away, but her grip was iron, her arms like bands of steel wrapped around him. She smiled, and her smile was no longer beautiful. It was the smile of something that had been waiting for him, specifically him, for a very long time. "They all look down eventually," she said. "The ones like you. The ones who hurt. The ones who break things that aren't theirs to break." "Please." Did Melissa say please? Did the others? I never. Don't lie." Her voice was gentle, almost tender. "Not now. Not at the end." She released him. For one wild moment, Travis thought she was letting him go. Then she began to dance alone, spinning in the moonlight, her hooves flashing silver as they rose and fell, rose and fell, rose and fell. The last thing Travis Hendricks saw was the prairie sky, vast and indifferent, as the woman in white danced on his chest until his ribs collapsed and his heart stopped and his lies finally fell silent. Morgan spent 3 days investigating. She interviewed the staff at the Rusty Spur, examined the crime scene until she knew every blade of grass and read everything she could find about Travis Hendricks' past. The picture that emerged made her stomach turn. 3 ex-girlfriends, 2 ex-wives, a pattern of escalating violence documented in police reports that somehow never resulted in charges. Melissa Hendricks, his most recent victim, was still in a women's shelter in Rapid City, rebuilding a face that had required 2 surgeries to repair. Morgan sat in her truck outside the shelter for an hour, trying to decide whether to go in. When she finally did, Melissa met her with the wary eyes of someone who had learned not to trust anyone in uniform. "I heard about Travis," Melissa said. Her voice was flat, emptied of whatever she might have felt. "They're saying an animal killed him. That's what the report will say." "But?" Morgan hesitated. "There were witnesses at the bar. They saw him leave with a woman. A woman in a white dress, very beautiful. No one knew her name or where she came from." Something flickered in Melissa's eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. "My grandmother used to tell me stories. She was Lakota, from the Pine Ridge Reservation. She talked about a woman who danced with men like Travis. Men who hurt women. Men who thought they'd never face consequences." She paused. "Grandma called her dear woman. What happened to the men?" "They died." Melissa's ruined face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "They all died. The second body was found 4 days later. Kyle Morrison, 41, a mechanic from Custer who'd served 3 years for aggravated assault against his teenage daughter. He was discovered in a field near the park's eastern boundary, his body bearing the same hoofprint pattern, the same impossible damage. Witnesses at the Rusty Spur remembered a woman in white. Beautiful. Mysterious. She danced with Kyle in the parking lot as the moon rose full and bright. The third body came 3 days after that. Derek Pruitt, 29, recently released from county jail after his 4th domestic violence arrest. Same injuries, same hoofprints, same witness accounts of a woman who seemed to glow in the darkness, who danced like something from a dream, whose feet no one could quite see beneath her long white dress. Sheriff Dawson called Morgan to a meeting at his office. His face was gray with exhaustion and something deeper, the look of a man confronting something his worldview couldn't accommodate. 3 deaths, same pattern, same whatever this is. He spread crime scene photos across his desk. "I've got the state police asking questions I can't answer. I've got reporters sniffing around, and I've got..." He stopped, rubbing his eyes. "I've got no idea what I'm dealing with." Morgan looked at the photos. 3 men, 3 predators, 3 endings that had come for them on hooves instead of handcuffs. "What do you want me to say, Sheriff?" "I want you to tell me there's a rational explanation. A person in a costume, some kind of weapon that makes those marks. Anything." Morgan thought about Melissa Hendricks' grandmother, about the stories she'd found in ethnographic records at the park library, deer woman legends spanning dozens of tribes, centuries of warnings about a beautiful spirit who punished those who violated sacred bonds. About the hoofprints that appeared beside high-heeled tracks and then simply ended, as if the woman wearing them had transformed mid-step into something else entirely. "I don't have a rational explanation," she said. I have a pattern. All 3 victims had histories of violence against women. All 3 were seen with the same woman before they died. All 3 were found with injuries consistent with being trampled by a deer. So, what are you saying? Some kind of vigilante? I'm saying maybe we're looking at this wrong. Morgan gathered the photos and stacked them neatly. Maybe the question isn't who's doing this. Maybe the question is why these 3 men and not the hundreds of others who deserve the same. Dawson stared at her. That's not how justice works. No, Morgan agreed. It's not. She left his office and drove to the Rusty Spur. It was late afternoon, the parking lot empty except for a few trucks belonging to the after-work crowd. She went inside and ordered a beer she didn't intend to drink, then sat at the end of the bar where the woman in white had been seen, watching the door. She sat there until closing. The woman never appeared. But as Morgan walked to her truck in the moonlit parking lot, she heard something behind her. The click of hooves on gravel. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. The woman stood 20 feet away. She was exactly as the witnesses had described. Dark hair, impossible beauty. A white dress that moved in a breeze Morgan couldn't feel. Her eyes caught the moonlight and held it, glowing with a light that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "You've been looking for me," the woman said. Her voice was soft, melodic, carrying clearly across the distance between them. "I've been investigating 3 deaths. 3 killings. There's a difference." The woman stepped closer. Her movements were fluid, graceful, inhuman. "You've seen what they were, what they did. You've talked to the women they broke. That doesn't give anyone the right to, right?" The woman laughed, and the sound was like wind through tall grass. "I was dancing in these hills when your ancestors hadn't yet learned to write. I remember when this land knew justice that didn't come from courts or judges. Some wounds don't heal with prison sentences, Ranger. Some debts can only be paid in kind." Morgan's hand moved toward her radio, then stopped. What would she say? To whom? "Are you going to kill me?" The woman tilted her head, studying Morgan with those luminous eyes. "Have you earned my dance?" A pause. A held breath. "No," Morgan whispered. "No, I haven't. No." The woman smiled, and her smile was sad and ancient and terrifying all at once. "You haven't, but you've also stopped asking the wrong questions. That's rare." She began to walk away, her white dress trailing behind her in the moonlight. After 3 steps, the shape of her body began to change, elongating, shifting, her limbs folding into configurations that made Morgan's eyes water. Between one heartbeat and the next, a white-tailed deer stood where the woman had been. It looked back at Morgan with eyes that still held a human intelligence, then bounded into the darkness and was gone. Morgan stood alone in the empty parking lot for a long time. The official reports listed all 3 deaths as wildlife incidents, likely bison encounter. Sheriff Dawson signed them without comment. The state police accepted the explanation, and the reporters moved on to other stories. Melissa Hendricks moved to Montana 6 months later. She sent Morgan a postcard with no return address. "Thank you for listening. Some of us know the truth, even if we can't say it out loud." Morgan kept the postcard in her desk drawer. She kept the crime scene photos too, locked in a file cabinet she never opened. And sometimes, late at night, she drove out to the prairie and parked at the edge of the grassland and watched the deer moving through the moonlit hills. They were just deer, she told herself. Just animals, graceful and wild, living their ancient lives in an ancient place. But sometimes, just before dawn, she thought she saw one of them watching her back, a doe standing perfectly still at the edge of her headlights, eyes glowing with something that might have been recognition. And sometimes, when the wind was right, she could almost hear music, drums and footsteps and heartbeats, woven together into a rhythm older than memory. She never answered it, but she never forgot it either. And she never stopped wondering, in the quiet spaces of her mind, whether justice and mercy were really so different. Whether some debts could only be collected by those who existed outside human law. Whether the woman in white was a monster or a protector or something in between that had no name in any language she knew. The prairie kept its secrets. The cave breathed its ancient breath. And somewhere in the darkness, the deer woman danced, waiting for the next man foolish enough to believe that cruelty had no consequences. She had all the time in the world. She always did. Location: Isle Royale National Park, Michigan. Date: October 27, 2019. The morning fog rolled across Rock Harbor like something breathing, slow and deliberate, swallowing the dock pilings one by one until they vanished into gray nothing. Wesley Thornton stood on the ranger station porch with his thermos of coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the mist erase the world in increments. 45 miles from the Michigan mainland. No roads in or out. The last ferry of the season had departed 3 days ago, and the seaplane wouldn't return until spring, unless there was an emergency evacuation. For the next 6 months, Isle Royale would belong to the wolves in the winter and the small crew of rangers tasked with closing everything down before the lake froze solid. He took a sip of coffee, lukewarm now, bitter, and listened to the particular silence of the island in late October. The summer crowds were gone, the hiking trails empty, the campgrounds returning to wildness. Somewhere across the harbor, a loon called out, its trembling wail echoing off the fog before fading into nothing. Wesley had heard that sound 1,000 times in his 7 years on the island, but this morning, it seemed different somehow. Lonelier, more like a question than a call. The radio inside crackled to life, and he stepped back into the warmth of the station, setting his thermos on the desk beside the laminated map of the island's trail system. Red pins marked the locations they'd already winterized: Daisy Farm, Mosky Basin, the Feltman Lake Cabin. Blue pins showed what remained: 3 more backcountry sites, the Wendigo Ranger Station on the far side of the island, and the fire tower on Mount Ojibwe, that needed its shutters secured before the first real snow. Rock Harbor, this is Wendigo. You copy? The voice belonged to Sandra Chen, the district's other remaining ranger stationed 30 miles away on the island's southwest shore. Wesley keyed the mic. Wendigo, Rock Harbor. Go ahead, Sandra. Just checking the morning frequency. Got some weather coming in tonight. Lake effect snow may be 4 to 6 inches. You still planning to hit Ojibwe today? That's the plan. Should be back before dark. Copy that. Hey, did dispatch mention anything about a late season permit? I'm showing 1 active registration that wasn't on yesterday's list. Solo hiker, female, checked in at Rock Harbor 2 days ago for a 5-day backcountry trip. Wesley frowned, pulling the permit log from the desk drawer. He flipped through the carbon copies until he found it, the registration he'd processed himself on Friday afternoon, though the memory felt strangely distant now, like something from weeks ago rather than days. Paige Whitmore, age 28, solo permit for the Greenstone Ridge Trail, planning to camp at Hatchet Lake and return via the Minong Ridge before the final evacuation window. Yeah, I've got her here, Wesley said. Whitmore. She was supposed to check back in yesterday for a weather update but never showed. I figured she was still out on the ridge. Might want to confirm her position. With this front coming in, anyone still on trail needs to start heading back. Radio me if you need support. Will do. Rock Harbor out. He set down the mic and stared at the permit form. Something about it bothered him. Not the information itself, which was entirely ordinary, but the handwriting. Careful, precise letters that seemed to press too hard into the paper, as if the writer had been concentrating with unusual intensity. In the emergency contact field, she'd written a phone number and a single word: Mom. Wesley finished his coffee, pulled on his jacket, and began gathering his gear for the hike to Mount Ojibwe. The tower was a 6-mile round trip, mostly along the Greenstone Ridge, the same trail Paige Whitmore had taken 2 days ago. If he was lucky, he'd cross paths with her on his way up or down. If not, he'd radio Sandra and they'd initiate a welfare check before the weather moved in. He stepped outside into the fog, and somewhere in the distance, deeper in the island's interior, he heard a sound that might have been a branch breaking, or might have been something else entirely. Paige had woken before dawn that morning, though she couldn't have said exactly when. The sky above her tent was still dark, and the cold had crept into her sleeping bag during the night, settling into her bones with a persistence that no amount of shifting or curling could dispel. She'd camped at Hatchet Lake as planned, her tent pitched in the designated site between the water's edge and the tree line. But something about the night had felt wrong from the moment she'd zipped the rainfly closed. The silence, maybe. She'd expected silence on Isle Royale. That was part of why she'd come, to escape the noise of her life in Minneapolis, the job she hated, the apartment that felt too small, the texts from her mother that came every hour asking if she was okay, if she was eating enough, if she'd thought about moving back home. But this silence was different. It had weight to it, presence, like the air itself was holding its breath. She'd heard the wolves around midnight, or thought she had. A single howl, thin and distant, rising from somewhere to the north, then nothing. No response from the pack, no chorus of calls, just that one voice crying out and then stopping abruptly, as if something had silenced it mid-note. Now, packing her tent in the gray pre-dawn light, Paige kept looking over her shoulder at the tree line. The fog had rolled in overnight, thick enough to blur the shore of the lake into a smear of gray, and the forest behind her had become a wall of shadows that seemed to shift whenever she wasn't looking directly at it. She told herself it was just the mist moving, just the early light playing tricks. She almost believed it. Her plan for the day was to continue east along the greenstone ridge toward the Mount Ojibwe Tower, then descend to Rock Harbor and check in with the ranger station before the weather turned. 12 miles, maybe 13. A long day, but manageable if she kept a steady pace. She'd done longer hikes in worse conditions. She shouldered her pack and started up the trail, and within minutes the fog had swallowed Hatchet Lake behind her. The world shrank to a tunnel of gray. The path beneath her feet, the ghostly shapes of spruce and birch on either side, and somewhere ahead, the promise of higher ground where the mist might finally clear. She didn't hear the clicking sound until she'd been walking for almost an hour. Faint, rhythmic, like someone tapping two sticks together in the woods to her left. She stopped, listening. The sound stopped too. She waited. Nothing. She started walking again, and there it was, click, 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 matching her footsteps, always just out of sight in the fog. "Hello?" she called. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, absorbed by the mist before it could carry. "Is someone there?" The clicking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant lapping of lake water. Just the fog and the trees and the sudden, certain knowledge that she was not alone on this trail. Wesley found the first sign 2 miles up the Greenstone Ridge. A hiking pole, aluminum and expensive, lying across the trail as if it had been dropped rather than placed. He picked it up and examined it. No damage, no blood, nothing to suggest violence. But the wrist strap was still attached, still looped, as if whoever had been holding it had simply let their arm fall open and allowed the pole to slip free. He keyed his radio. "Wendigo, this is Rock Harbor. Sandra, you copy?" Static. He tried again. More static, thicker this time, with an undertone that sounded almost like breathing. "Sandra, this is Wesley. I found gear on the Greenstone Ridge about 2 miles east of the Ojibwe Junction. Hiking pole, looks recent. Attempting to locate the owner." The static shifted, and for a moment he thought he heard a voice. Not Sandra's, something thinner, more distant, but then it dissolved into white noise and he was left with nothing. He clipped the hiking pole to his pack and continued up the trail. The fog had grown denser as he climbed, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the last hour. His breath plumed in front of him, and the moisture in the air had begun to crystallize on his jacket, his beard, the edges of his hat. Somewhere in the trees to his right, a branch snapped with a sound like a bone breaking. Wesley stopped. He'd been in these woods long enough to know the difference between a branch falling under its own weight and a branch broken by something moving through the forest. This was the latter. Something heavy, moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with him. "Hello?" he called. "Miss Whitmore? Park Service. If you can hear me, please respond." No answer. But the woods to his right had gone silent. No squirrels, no chickadees, nothing. Just that particular emptiness that meant something was there, something that had frightened everything else away. He thought about what old Harold Makwa had told him years ago, back when Wesley first started working on the island. Harold had been a maintenance worker at the lodge, Ojibwe from the Red Cliff Band, and he'd grown up hearing stories about Isle Royale that weren't in any guidebook. The old ones called this place Minong, Harold had said. Means a good place to get copper. But there are other things on this island older than the copper, older than the trees. Things that were here before the Anishinaabe came, and will be here long after we're gone. The elders called them Baycock, the Bone Walkers, hunters who starved so long ago that death forgot to take them completely. They wander the deep woods in winter, looking for people who've wandered too far from home. Wesley had smiled politely and filed it away as local color, the kind of folklore that made for good campfire stories but meant nothing in the light of day. Now, standing alone in the fog with the silence pressing against him, he found himself remembering every word. Paige saw the tower first, a dark shape rising out of the mist ahead, the fire lookout on Mount Ojibwe materializing like a ghost of a building, more suggestion than structure. She felt a surge of relief that surprised her with its intensity. The tower meant she was close to Rock Harbor, close to the ranger station, close to other people. Another few hours and she'd be off this island, waiting for the emergency seaplane, laughing at herself for getting spooked by fog and silence. She started toward the tower, and that's when she heard it clearly for the first time. Not just clicking, but movement. Something in the trees behind her, moving fast, faster than a person could move through that kind of undergrowth. The sound of branches snapping, of footsteps that weren't footsteps. Too light, too quick, too many of them at once, like something running on limbs that bent in the wrong places. She ran. She didn't mean to, didn't decide to. Her body simply took over, legs pumping, pack bouncing against her spine, lungs burning with cold air as she sprinted toward the tower. The fog tore past her in streamers, and behind her the sound grew louder, closer. A rattling cacophony of bone on bone that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees on both sides, from the sky above, from the ground beneath her feet. The tower steps. She hit them at a full run, taking them two at a time, her hands scrabbling at the railing for purchase. The cab at the top was locked. Of course it was locked, but the platform around it was enclosed by a waist-high railing, and she pressed herself against the door, panting, looking down at the trail below. The fog swirled. The trees stood motionless. Nothing moved. But something was watching. She could feel it. Not see it. Not hear it. Just feel it. A presence at the edge of perception that radiated hunger the way a fire radiates heat. It was old, that presence. Patient. It had been hunting these woods since before there were names for the things that lived and died here. And it had found her. "Please," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was asking. "Please, I just want to go home." The fog below her shifted, and for one terrible moment she saw it. A shape that was almost human, almost whole, but stretched and broken in ways that made her mind refuse to process what her eyes were seeing. Bones where there should have been skin, hollows where there should have been eyes, a mouth that opened too wide, full of something that gleamed like wet stone. Then the fog closed again, and Paige Whitmore screamed. Wesley heard the scream from half a mile away, a single ragged sound that cut through the fog like a blade, and then stopped with an abruptness that told him everything he needed to know. He broke into a run, his pack forgotten, his radio forgotten, every instinct screaming at him to turn back even as his legs carried him forward. He reached the tower 17 minutes later, his lungs burning, his legs shaking with exertion. The platform above was empty. No sign of anyone, no blood, no struggle. Just a backpack lying on its side against the railing, its contents spilled across the weathered wood. A water bottle, a compression sack, a paperback book with its pages fluttering in the wind that had finally begun to stir the fog. And something else. Something that made Wesley stop breathing for a long, terrible moment. A single boot. Women's size 7. the same brand and color as the hiking boots registered on Paige Whitmore's permit. It sat upright near the railing, laces still tied, as if whoever had been wearing it had simply stepped out of it, stepped out and stepped away, into the fog, into the trees, into whatever waited in the spaces between the things that could be explained. He looked up at the locked cab, at the platform, at the endless gray that surrounded him on all sides. The wind was picking up now, and with it came a sound he almost didn't recognize. A soft, rhythmic clicking, like bones knocking together, fading into the distance toward the interior of the island. Wesley keyed his radio one last time. "Wendigo, this is Rock Harbor. Sandra, please respond. I have a missing person at the Ojibwe Tower. Possible. He couldn't finish the sentence. What could he say? Possible supernatural entity? Possible abduction by something that shouldn't exist? The radio crackled, and Sandra's voice came through, distant and distorted, but real. "Rock Harbor, I copy. Say again your last?" He closed his eyes and breathed. "Missing hiker at Ojibwe. I'm initiating search protocols. Request backup when weather permits." "Copy that. Weather's moving in fast. You need to get off that ridge before dark." "Wesley, do you copy? Get off the ridge." "I copy," he said. But he didn't move. He stood there on the empty platform, holding a single boot, listening to the wind and the silence and the fading click of something retreating into the fog. Something that had been hunting these woods for longer than anyone could remember. Something that had found what it was looking for. They never found Paige Whitmore. The search lasted 3 days, until the snow became too heavy and the risk to the search teams too great. They found her tent at Hatchet Lake still staked and tidy. They found her other hiking pole a 1/4 mile from the tower, lying in the middle of the trail. They found her emergency contact information in the permit log and made the call that no ranger ever wants to make. The official report listed her as missing, presumed deceased, cause undetermined. There was talk of a fall, of exposure, of the 100 ways the wilderness can kill someone who underestimates its dangers. No one mentioned the boot on the tower platform. No one mentioned the clicking sound that 3 different searchers reported hearing in the fog before the search was called off. No one mentioned what old Harold Makwa said when he heard the news, the way he shook his head and whispered something in Ojibwe that Wesley didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. Wesley transferred to Pictured Rocks the following spring, a mainland park, roads and cell service and the comforting presence of other people, always nearby, always within reach. He told himself it was for practical reasons, career advancement, better housing, proximity to his aging parents in Marquette. But sometimes, in the deep of winter, when the wind comes howling off Superior and the trees creak like old bones settling, he still hears it. That clicking sound, patient and rhythmic, somewhere in the distance. And he remembers what Harold told him once in the quiet of the lodge after the tourists had gone to bed. The baycock never forgets a face, and it never stops being hungry. He keeps his doors locked now. He checks them twice, 3 times before he sleeps. And he never ever goes into the woods alone after dark. Some hungers, he has learned, are older than memory, and some places remember everything.